Hello everyone, Dave Senior here. Welcome to my numeracy lesson plan. Today's lesson will be on frames per second. I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome. Today's lesson will be talking about frames per second. Now, what is frames per second? What does that mean? Well, we'll take a look. The definition of frames per second is a measurement of how motion video is displayed. The term applies equally to film video and digital video. You can think of each frame as a still image. So we'll break this down. Frames per second. The word per means for each, as in kilometers per hour, kilometers for each hour. So here we're looking at frames for each second. Now we all know seconds. Seconds, there are 60 seconds in 1 minute. That'll be important for later. We also now have to talk about frames. In standard cinematic movies, there are 24 frames per second. That means there are 24 still images flying by the screen in front of your eyes every single second. 24. That looks like this. Now, this is a lot of information to be flying past the screen during a 1 second interval. If you think about it, 1 second's being 24 still images. It seems like a lot, but that's what we're going to be breaking down today is the math equation to calculate how many frames are in an amount of time. So by the end of the class, we will be able to use a very simple math formula to take a look at a time and know exactly how many frames or still images are contained within that amount. Now, you may raise your hand and say, Mr. Senior, but at home I have a gaming computer and I've overclocked the settings so I can run my games of Fortnite at 100 frames per second. Why is the cinematic standard 24 FPS when I can run my video games at 100 FPS? And are there other frame rates out there that we need to know about? Here's my answer to you. Yes. The answer is yes. There are many different kinds of frame rates, and we'll go over some of the examples of those in a moment. But for now, and for the purpose of this lesson in this class, we will be dealing with 24 frames per second, or 24 FPS. This is because it is the cinematic standard used in most movies, including what we'll be looking at a bit later, stop motion. And we'll explain why later in the lesson. But before we do any of that, let's take a look at 24 frames per second as used in a stop motion animation, just so we can get an idea of what it looks like. As you can see, 24 frames per second gives a very smooth look to stop motion animation, and you can now understand that every second there are 24 still images flying by that make up each second. Now we're going to step away from 24 frames per second for a little bit, but don't forget that is what we're going to be using in class. But I just want to give a well-rounded approach to frames, and in order to do that, I want to take a look at the other things that you can shoot on different frames per second and how they're utilized in film. Come with me on this journey. All right, first up, we got 12 frames per second. This is used in classic animation. A lot of the Disney films back in the day, the original hand drawn Disney films, used 12 frames per second for their animation. Modern directors like Wes Anderson use the 12 frames per second on their animated stop motion films like Fantastic Mr. Fox or Isle of Dogs to create that original classic animation feel. 16 frames per second is the standard for old-fashioned films. This is what they used to project on when the projectors were hand cranked. This is in the days of Charlie Chaplin, silent films, black and white, vaudeville, all of that good stuff. That was all projected 16 frames per second by a hand cranked projectionist up in the top of theaters. So if you can imagine that, some guy sitting there for the entire movie. Now, granted, movies weren't as long as they are today, 3 hours plus time, but you can just picture that guy up there. 16 frames per second. We'll talk a little bit more about them later, but for now, we'll move on. 22 frames per second is an interesting frame rate as Some movies switch to this in the middle of the movie for fight scenes. 22 frames per second gives a really good sense of action. It speeds up everything from that 24 frames per second, so things are going a little bit faster. The Sherlock Holmes movies utilize this really good. They would switch to a 22 FPS during all of the fight sequences to give that little bit more of a rush of action. The second most common frame rate is 30 frames per second. This is because television projected most of its content at 30 frames per second since televisions existed. This is the common look for sitcoms, soap operas, and reality television. And to this very day, most TV shows, unless it's on a premium channel or something, will be projected at 30 frames per second. This gives almost a home movie quality kind of feel to it that cinematic standard of 24 does not really achieve. Now we're going to get up into the complicated stuff because this is fairly new. 48 frames per second are Ultra HD films. The first movie that succeeded in doing this was Peter Jackson's The Hobbit films. He wanted to accomplish a more fantasy feel, so he shot on 48 frames per second, which essentially means there's twice as much data flying by your eyes at a time. Now, love it or hate it, he did it, and now we have The Hobbit in 3 movies. So 48 frames per second. There it is. When you get up to the amounts of 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second, you're looking at high-end commercials, most of the time featuring vehicles, cars, those really, really fast shots of them sliding through the dirt, that kind of thing. That's where you're going to run to the higher numbers like 60 and 120 frames per second. Uh, yeah, there you go. Now we're going to get up really high, 300 frames per second. Why would you need that? Well, sports, of course. Sports, in order to slow down for replays, they need many, many more frames in between it. 300 frames per second is the standard for sports. Then they can break it down to 1/10 of the time for the replays, and we can experience all of the details of the athletes playing their games. Now, anything higher than 300 frames per second is usually for scientific purposes. It's so they can slow down and experience nature or experiments like this fun color one we've got up on the screen now. You're not going to really see this in any sort of practical sense because it costs so much and there's so much data going by. But it is possible to exceed 300 frames per second if you're doing ultra slow-mo work. And that brings us back to our good old friend 24 frames per second. Now, most movies that you've seen in your time were projected at 24 frames per second. Again, that means there are 24 still images flying past your eye at any given second during a movie. So, why is that important? And more importantly, why 24 frames per second? Why was that the standard? Who came up with that? Well, I'm about to tell you. Way, way back in 1926, a man named Frank Rich invented a device called the Vitaphone. This device allowed them to sync audio and video for the first time in movie theaters, creating the first moving pictures with sound. So, Frank Rich, obviously a really great guy, he teamed up with Sam Warner at Warner Brothers to develop this for theaters across America at the time and eventually the world. So, over at Western Electric, there was a gentleman named Stanley Watkins. Stanley was a very, very smart guy, and it was his job to figure out exactly how they were going to sync the video and the audio. So, Stanley, Sam Warner, Frank Rich, who invented the Vitaphone, Sam Warner, of course, from Warner Brothers, all headed over to the Warner Brothers lot. They went up to the projection booth and they talked to the chief projectionist. Stanley wanted to see what his opinion was. Now, back in 1926, they didn't actually talk about frames per second like we are doing now. They talked about film in feet, how long a roll of film was that was getting cramped through the projection or the camera on the day when they were filming. So, Stanley Watkins asked the chief projectionist at Warner how much film was going through the projections at the time. The chief projectionist said at Warner Brothers they usually get 80 to 90 feet of film cranked through the projection at the time. Some of the smaller theaters were cranking 100 feet at a time to get the movies through faster so they could have more turnaround on the seats at the theaters. So Stanley Watkins decided to compromise. He said the average is 90 feet per minute being cranked through these projections, and that just happened to convert 90 feet to 24 frames per second. Now, this had to become the cinematic standard because when they were shipping film and audio all over the world separately, they needed to sync up correctly. So, by deciding 90 feet per minute was the amount they were going to go with at Warner Brothers in the 1920s, all subsequent films have had to follow the 24 frames per second so they could sync their audio. Now, of course, today we shoot digitally and we have our sound files synced during the production, but back in the day, and especially in 1926, you had separate teams working together, people in dark rooms cutting film by hand, stitching them together with tape. This was the way of things. So it made sense to have some sort of commonality across the entire industry. And therefore, we were ended up with 24 frames per second. Now, you may ask, Mr. Senior, that's all well and good. We now understand there are 24 still images per second flying by a screen at any given time of a movie. But how is that going to work for us? What are we going to do with that in our lives? How is that going to change anything? Well, it's nice to understand these concepts at a core level, but practically, it comes in handy all of the time. One of the best examples I can give is stop motion animation. I'm sure we've all experienced stop motion films before, whether it be Nightmare Before Christmas or our good friends Wallace and Gromit. But did you know you could make your own stop motion films at home? There's an entire industry out there available on the internet on YouTube called Brickworks, where people make entire films using their little Lego figurines and stop motion techniques. This is a non-traditional career choice, of course, but it's something that if you had some Lego, you could get started with today. There are many tutorials on the internet of how you could get started and all of the different procedures in place to create some brickworks. But the concept is essentially deciding on a frame rate, 24 frames per second, and taking 24 pictures of a Lego figurine and stitching them to all together in an editing program so you create a little animated film. It looks a little something like this on the screen that you're watching right now. This is something that you can do at home with a camera and a small Lego set. Brickworks is a smaller side of stop animation. If we want to take a look at the leading industry standard, we'd need to travel all the way to Portland, Oregon, in the United States, and take a look at Leica Studio, who handles some of the most ambitious stop motion projects in the world. If you're not familiar with Leica, I'm going to play a little trailer right now, but they've done a bunch of crazy great stop motion films: Kubo and the Two Strings, Coraline, Box Trolls, Paranorman. So let's watch this trailer, and we will talk more about stop motion and Leica in a moment.
Looking back, I guess you could say the odds have never really been tilted in our favor. Conventional wisdom says this wouldn't and shouldn't work,
Awesome!
but here we are. In our 10 years, we've learned that not only are we filmmakers, we're engineers, city planners, electricians, and adventurers. We are a passionate group of artists who believe that the smallest details help tell the bigger story. Looking forward, we continue to evolve.
Whatever your quest, it is now my quest too.
Growing our studio, our art, our craft, our technology, and our ambition.
I can't believe you did this!
A lot has happened in 10 years, but we're really just scratching the surface. As our stories continue to expand, we'll take them to bigger, bolder, and more surprising heights. For a decade, we've been doing what some might call mad, what some might call magic, We call it Leica.
You're just in time for supper, dear.
Can't you be like other kids your age?
Oh, baby.
This is my moment.
As you've just seen, Leica does not mess around when it comes to stop motion animation. They have an entire team of people working for years on a single film. It is truly the art of love to be able to put so much of yourself into your projects like that. So, that is the sort of end goal career cream of the crop. If you wanted to get into stop motion, Leica is definitely the place to be. They push the limits, they do things that no one else is doing right now, both practically and with visual effects. If this is something that you're interested in pursuing, learning stuff like frames per second and techniques within stop motion animation are skills essential to being successful in a career as a stop motion technician or artist. So we all understand there are 24 frames in a second flying by the screen every second that a movie is happening. But how do we calculate exactly how many frames are in 10 seconds, 20 seconds, a minute? Well, there is a very simple math equation that I'm going to teach you right now, and we're all going to work together on a quick example of how you could apply this equation to figure out how many frames are in an amount of time. Let's start with 10 seconds. How many frames are in 10 seconds? Well, we simply multiply 10 by 24. 10 seconds times 24 frames per second equals 240 frames. Let's do one that's a bit more complicated. Let's pick 5 minutes. All right, how many frames are in 5 minutes? First, we have to calculate how many seconds are in 5 minutes. So we take the number 5 and we multiply it by 60 seconds to get the number 300. We then multiply that by 24 frames per second to get our final answer, 7,200 frames. There are 7,200 frames in 5 minutes. And it's that easy. You all now understand frames per second, how the cinematic standard is 24, how it's utilized in stop motion, and how to do a simple math equation to figure out time to frames per second. I hope you've enjoyed learning about frames per second.
Thanks for watching, everyone. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out to me. I'll see you all next time.